When dealing with relationship experts, people often imagine that it's smooth sailing as far as their own marriage is concerned. In fact, highly sought-after relationship expert Dr. Chris Hart asserts that one has to have lived life and gone through rough experiences for them to be qualified counselors. Nobody knows better than him, and true to his point, Dr. Chris Hart narrates his experiences in marriage and his strong opinions on marriage and religion.
My name's Chris Hart and I'm a psychologist, and I work on several areas actually. I work on social skills. I do a lot of work with, for example, managers on how to manage, how to deal with clients, how to interact with people in their workplace. But what I'm best known for is personal social skills. The process of meeting people, dating, falling out, getting married, all the things that happen in marriages. Divorces, parenting, yes, divorce, all of it. And I'm best known for that. That's where people see me a lot. They see me on TV and radio and the magazines, you know. But as I say, I do other things as well. Everybody thinks of me as a counsellor, and I think counselling is in its infancy here. There are an awful lot of very young people who are called counsellors, and I don't think really it's right for them to be called counsellors. In order to be a good counsellor, you've got to have some experience, you've got to have lived life, and some bad things have got to have happened to you. Otherwise you don't understand bad things. You know, a 20-odd-year-old person has probably had nothing bad happen in their lives. They've been healthy, they've had no serious upsets in their relationships, nobody's cheated on them or anything like that. And so when they encounter the sort of situations that happen in 45-year-olds, it's unreal. They can't sympathise with it at all, they don't understand. So I think, almost by definition, a counsellor should be more than 45 and should have had some pretty rough things happen to them. You know, then they begin to understand. And they also understand that lives are very different. People have difficult decisions to make in their lives, and people make them in different ways.
Imagine being left behind by your wife for another woman.
People already were beginning to get married older, later. You know, it wasn't quite so common to get married that young. But I was married to that lady for 20 years. And then it fell apart spectacularly. And that's what happens sometimes, isn't it? It's a sad story, actually. I was ill. My thyroid stopped working. And so I wasn't really completely okay. And she started getting in with the local headmistress. Can you imagine? The two women have been living together ever since. You know, sometimes people form terribly close platonic friendships. And it was something like that. They became notorious in our village because it was almost like they spoke a private language. Do you know what I mean? People couldn't get between them at all. And like I say, I wasn't very well. And so I didn't even know I was unwell until about the time it all started.
Life at 20 is all about discovering yourself. It's about finding out the things that hurt you and the things that make you feel good. It allows you to start carving your life the way you want. For Dr. Chris Hart, a college student at the time, life at 20 meant starting a new life with the love of his life.
Oh, well, the first wedding was a completely traditional wedding. Little tiny church in a little English village, the whole thing, you know. Very romantic, very pretty, very lovely. And me and my first wife, we were very happy together. We were students, you see, and my parents didn't have a great deal of money, so I'd already got the idea that you work your way through college. So the two of us were like church mice. You know, we had no money, lived in a tiny little flat, and went through college. And it was good. At that age, you can't imagine anything going wrong, can you? So you imagine that everything will be fine. And of course, it comes as a bit of a shock when it isn't. And it came as a bigger shock to me than most, perhaps, because actually our marriage had been pretty much fault-free. You know, there'd been no problems. Nobody cheated, nobody done anything stupid. Everything was pretty straightforward. We managed our money together very well, joint accounts. We were very honest with one another. There was nothing to suggest that under the surface there was something wrong. And it was only when this lady turned up and these two became such friends. In fact, a very strange thing happened. I tried to persuade my wife to disengage from all of that for several years and failed. And eventually we divorced. And I'd not long been divorced when I got a letter from her wishing that we'd never parted. It was very strange. But it's all been done by then. And I was in a different life, you know.
Unfortunately, Dr. Chris's first marriage failed as his wife apparently left him for another woman. He had a thyroid infection and didn't imagine that he would experience divorce at such a young age.
I think the biggest lesson I learned is that it's not a good idea to get married too young, because people change too much in their early years. You know, in between 21 and 25, 27, your personality changes quite a lot. And so you're with someone who is a very good fit for you at that age. 10 years later, you're probably not quite such a good fit anymore. You know, you've got different ideas about how life should be lived. So I certainly think some of that went on in my first marriage. I think my first wife was very happy to be a penniless student. She liked the life of a penniless student. And then we go off and we become executives, you know, and start buying houses and stuff like that. I don't think she was ever very comfortable with that. And I know that that had a small part to play. Yes, not rich, but we were suddenly not penniless students anymore. You know, when you're a penniless student in London, there's a definite lifestyle associated with it, and it's very frivolous, and there's no responsibilities. It's fun. And no responsibilities. That's the critical bit. You know, you don't think about anything. But go fast forward 10 years, 2 children and a mortgage and, you know, difficult jobs to do. It's a different sort of thing, isn't it? And so I think the age had something to do with that. Well, fortunately, people don't anymore. People who are educated now get married, the men around about 30 and the women even later still. So it's not so much of a problem, really. But yes, it was a shame what happened to us, but you just have to accept these things in life, don't you? Well, our lives were incompatible by then, because by then I had started travelling a lot and I was living abroad, you know, and I was all over the world. And to have gone back wouldn't have worked then. You know, she was obviously settled with this other woman, and it was better to just let them get on with that. So that's what happened.
It was during this period that Dr. Chris also went back to school again and changed his career from being a chemist to a psychologist.
I went to work for a great big multinational because I first trained as a chemist. You know, a real chemist, laboratory, not pharmacy. And I went to work for a big multinational petrochemical company, and I worked for them for 15 years. And sort of towards the end of that 15 years, I began to realize that I don't know, how can I put it, my values and theirs didn't match. So I began to think about going back to college, and then eventually became a psychologist.
After all, lessons learned in his first marriage and understanding his needs in a relationship, Dr. Chris flew all the way to Kenya to start his life all over again. Life handed Dr. Chris a second chance by making him meet Caroline Tolo, a quiet but witty woman who is a second-earned black belt by her own right. Their journey of love began on the internet, and after many chats and coffee dates later, Chris and Caroline became an item.
I was already here, obviously, and I was working and quite well known. And she just wrote me an email asking a question. And for some reason, we just started to correspond. Normally, I write one thing in reply, and that's it. But we spent several months just quietly talking about this and that, nothing much, and decided to meet. And she was living in Kisumu at the time. So, yeah, we just met. And then a few more months went by where we quietly chatted about this and that. And then, you know, the inevitable happened. She wrote to me at an email address that was in the newspaper. And she was just treating me as a professional, you know. She'd got a question, and I just thought I could answer it. So that's how it started.
My name is Caroline Tolo. I'm a second-dan black belt, and I'm a personal trainer. It's amazing people meet on the internet nowadays. He'd written an article, and I liked it, and I said, let me just write to this guy and tell him my opinion and what I think. And I didn't think much of it. And he replied. And then we started talking slowly. We talked for 2 years. Just talking, and it would get more friendly. He would like, what do you do? Where do you live? But then I was still with my parents in Kisumu. So we would talk. Then one day he'd come to work to Kisumu, and he said, let's meet and have coffee. And then one coffee led to too many, and now we're here. It was a bit exciting. At that time, I didn't think that anything would come out of it. I was just saying, okay, I've been chatting to this guy for 2 years. Let me go and meet him. Let's see. But I wasn't thinking like, oh, okay, it will be serious. So when we met, I liked him. We met and just had tea. And he said, this was fun. And I also said, I like him. Let's meet again. And that time I would come to Nairobi for tournaments. So each time I would come, because most tournaments were being held in Nairobi. For some reason, they were always in Nairobi those days. So each time I was coming for a tournament, I would tell him, I'm coming, there's a game. Let's meet after the game.
There are a lot of things that drew Dr. Chris to Caroline, things that in his point of view he could only identify in his later stage in life.
She's very honest, really honest, and I've come to realize that that's one of the bedrocks of a relationship. If there is anything that is not quite honest, I don't mean deliberate lies, but non-disclosure, you know what I mean, things you don't talk about, all of these things eat away at relationships. And so I gradually realized that that was incredibly important. And also, another thing that's very important is a very strong sense of yourself in both parties. I think one of the things that went wrong in my first marriage was that Tessa, her name was, she didn't have that. She was not clear about what she wanted, and she was not forthright in saying it. Well, Caroline's not like that. She knows exactly what's going on in her head, and she's able to talk about it. And so we're able to have much more sensible conversations about the problems that you face. You see what I mean?
The couple had a simple, customary wedding, and being that Dr. Chris is a devout Christian, they sought the blessings of the church afterwards. The duo settled for this type of arrangement since they considered themselves as a mature couple who knew what they wanted in marriage.
It was incredibly simple. It's just the minimum of everything, because you don't do it again, do you? I'm sorry about that. Big disappointment to you. And we did go to church for a blessing, but that's all. Nothing more than that. It's a very simple situation. I'm quite devout, but we weren't married in church. You don't do that again, do you? Do you? I don't. I'm an Anglican, and the Anglicans are a little bit weird about it. And so, I'm not going to, not sure quite how to put this, but certainly the church I belong to is a little bit old-fashioned about that. And so to me it was never an issue, So I did, as I say, when we were established, quite some time afterwards, went to the church and said, I would like this relationship to be blessed, because you've known about it for years, even though you don't completely approve, which of course they did. Oh, a huge number. Oh, it was a big ceremony, but it was part of another ceremony. It was the Anglican Church does that. They put 2 or 3 things together. So there must have been several hundred.
He said we eat too much because it's always a celebration. Goats are slaughtered, everything. It's a celebration, but he sees it different. But he wanted everybody to recognize that we are together, and we are living together. And I just wanted something simple, because I come from an extended family, like I said, and I have a lot of older sisters who've been down the path, and some of them spent a lot in weddings, and some of them spent modestly, and I say at the end of the day, what makes you happy?
Long in what you might call ordinary clothes. It wasn't a wedding, you see. It was a very nice dress, and I wore a ordinary suit, Nothing special at all. I know this is a huge disappointment to you. You see, I suppose I just view things differently when you're older. It's a different thing altogether. It's not like the first flush of youth and all the romance and all the other things. Because I think older people know themselves better and they know what they're doing, and it's not quite such a rite of passage in the way that it is for a young person, because you've been married for years, haven't you? Previous relationships. And you've been in the married group of people in society and thought like a married person for many years. Not like somebody who's been determinedly single and then suddenly becomes a married person. That's a big change. She had had relationships before, and she was a mature woman. You know, she wasn't a little thing, 18-year-old, no ideas of her own. Far from it. A woman running a business and doing all sorts of things. You know what I mean? Substantial woman in her own right.
Being that the couple comes from different backgrounds and culture, they had to learn how to deal with the challenge of cultural conflicts for their marriage to work.
Well, we have the background issue. I have a lot of relatives and a lot of family, and he sees it differently. Like sometimes the house is full of relatives, and sometimes he's like, oh, we don't see eye to eye with that. And because I come from a different culture where we are an extended family and there's so many of us, and he comes from a culture where you have to say if you're coming to visit someone, and you have to say when you're leaving. So I find that a bit of a challenge, because if my whole family wants to come, I can't say no to them. But I have to ask him. And then sometimes they take too long staying here, and I'm like, okay, we are clashing. Because me, I'm like, okay, they're here and they see this as their house. Yeah. Well, I just tell him to put up with it and try to be nice to them and not throw tantrums and just to get along. It's a bit hard sometimes. You have to compromise a lot, because like sometimes, especially on my side, if the house is full of relatives and I'm telling him to be nice to everyone, and sometimes like I come from a culture where even my mother sometimes can't be free if he's around. So he has to like, even I tell him, you know, if my mom is here, you have to be very decent, and not that you get, you know, the customs and all that, yeah. So sometimes it's a bit, we compromise.
Despite the fact that he is a relationship guru, this down-to-earth love doctor still seeks counsel during difficulties in their marriage and advice that he recommends to other couples.
Well, there are two things really. I mean, first of all, her. I mean, she and I have a very clear understanding with one another that if we tell one another something, it will go no further. So I'm very happy to say things about how I feel, for example, or problems that I'm facing. I'll tell her, because I know she won't repeat it, and I know she'll treat it with respect. She won't use it against me, for example. And so, in effect, I go to her with anything that's bothering me. If I need more than that, then I know psychologists in England, for example, that I talk to. But that's quite rare now. I used to do it years ago in the sense that maybe I'd come up against a client with a very odd problem that I really didn't understand. So I would talk to them about that. But I don't do that much now. I've basically got a lot of experience now. I don't think I have seen a completely new problem now for several years. I've always seen some variation on a problem. You understand what I think it depends on the nature of the problem. Couples have to learn to deal with problems. So early on in a relationship, there isn't really a lot of point in going to see professionals. They really want to try and find their own way of dealing with things. When they begin to realize that they've tackled the same issue several times and it's not getting resolved, that's the signal that says that something is deeper than they can get their hands on. You know, that what they're arguing about isn't the real issue. And I think that's probably the sign that they should start to talk to a professional. The other thing so in other words, repeated issue. The other thing that's a signal is that you are no longer happy in the relationship. It's one thing to have problems, but basically your underlying emotion is that I'm happy to be with this person. The moment when you begin to realize that's not true anymore, that's a very strong warning sign. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So people who are lonely in the relationship, people who fear their partners, fear what they might say, worry about criticism, feel that they're not valued, not respected. All of that adding up to not happy. You're not happy with a person who criticizes you, isn't there for you, doesn't support you. You need to ask why, because I'm sure that was true at the point where you got married. And the most important thing is to find somebody who's been doing it a long time. You know, when something goes wrong with your relationship, the strongest feeling you have is that it's just you. You're unique. It's only you who's ever had this problem, and you're weird. How come it's happened to you? That's never true. So you need to talk to somebody who's seen thousands of people and who promptly says to you, oh yes, right, well you're not alone. This happens a lot. And this is what happens to couples in this situation, and this is how to deal with it. Because what you're doing is you're sharing experiences, and the biggest single thing that makes it easier for couples is the knowledge that this is not weird, that many people have faced this issue and survived. You see what I mean? If, for example, I've developed a set of values that says I insist on leading a rather weird life, endlessly drinking, lots and lots of crazy girls in crazy bars, and I won't take care of my family, and I am abusive to them and all the rest of it. What's the point in staying in a relationship like that? And if the person concerned won't change, doesn't see the need to change. Another serious area is personality disorders, because they're very hard to cure, mostly because the sufferer won't agree that they have a problem. And some of the personality disorders result in behaviors that are frankly intolerable, you know. And if they say, no, there's nothing wrong with me, she's to blame, he's to blame, that relationship is, you either get used to it. Would you like to live in a relationship that was miserable? Or you leave. There are, yeah, the phrase has a legal significance, and yes, there are irreconcilable differences. And don't get me wrong, this is not because people are evil or stupid or anything like that, but some of the forces that drive us to behave the way we do are very deep and very difficult to change. And so sometimes they can't be changed. Yes, I think I'm in a relationship which is as good as it ever gets. You know, we share values, we are honest with one another, we're kind and supportive to one another. And I often say that the best sign there is of a relationship that's working is that you feel, I use the term liberated. You know, you feel safe with the other person and you can talk about anything. And if you have that, then I think there's a very good chance that it's happy ever after. Now, of course, things can happen. You never know. But as near as is humanly possible, yeah, I think it's happily ever after.
Having learned many valuable lessons in marriage and relationships, Dr. Chris Hart shares with us his strong opinions on the relationship between marriage and religion. First, Dr. Chris Hart believes that in the medieval Europe, the church had no interest in marriage, but it was deemed to be a community affair. As he puts it, the verse in the Bible, "What God has put together, let no man asunder," was apparently added to give the church more influence in the state affairs.
That only came to be in sort of 1500, when the church began to say that a wedding is a sacrament and started to argue that it should all be done in church and so on. Prior to that, that wasn't the case. Well, it was just part of the liturgy for the service. It was put together by the people who wrote the liturgy. Well, you're getting onto deep stuff here, but if you look back into the ancient church, there's no sign of any marriage or wedding or anything like that at all. It all developed in around about 11, 12, 1300 in medieval Europe. Prior to that, nobody had any interest. Weird, isn't it? The proposal, by the way, is quite modern. If you go back to, say, 1200 AD, there weren't really church weddings. There weren't legal marriages in Europe. If a couple said in front of witnesses that they wished to be married, then they were married. So long as they could find somebody who would say, I saw these people exchange vows, then it was a marriage, and it was recognized completely. And what happened gradually after that is that the church began to lay down rules as to who could marry and what the circumstances were and so on. And so gradually the actual exchange of vows and the intent got separated. And so you had to agree privately, which became the proposal, before you went and agreed publicly, if you see what I mean. But go back far enough and it was all one and the same. You and I could be having a drunken evening in a bar and decide to get married. And because there were witnesses, we were married. Those days, if you agreed in front of, the agreement in front of witnesses was all that was needed. Go right back to 1200. Yeah. A little bit later, in the church service, the kiss was incorporated as the contract. You see, you've got to bear in mind that prior to about 11, 12, 1300, neither the state nor the church was interested in weddings at all. The wedding wasn't a sacrament. That came later. The law wasn't interested. What people did privately was nobody's business. The local community was passionately interested, but the state wasn't. In my more cynical moments, I think it's not an accident that the church of the day recognized that marriages were an enormously powerful institution, that they linked together rulers and countries and all the rest of it. And for the church to have an influence on how that happened would increase its own power. So I'm afraid it was politics. Originally, people didn't wear rings. The ring started as a part of the negotiation about the price for the bride. At the time when this started, rings were currency. People actually made gold and silver into rings, and they weighed it. And it used to be traditional to give the girl a ring as part of that negotiation. You see what I mean? Some of the rings along the way have been rather lovely. There was a thing called a gimel ring. Now, a gimel ring was like a ring that had been split into three, so that you had three rings. And it had a rough edge so that only one ring could fit together. So now, he would have one of them, put it on his little finger. She would wear another one. And the third one would be given to a witness. And the three of them would go about their lives until the negotiations were over. And then they would all be put back together on her finger. That's rather nice, isn't it? And the dowry is interesting because different cultures do different things with dowry. Some cultures, the man pays money to the bride's family. Some cultures, the bride's family pays money to the new family, ostensibly for her. And what's very interesting is that you can predict which is going to happen in any given culture. Because in any culture where, in antiquity, the ground was always tilled by women with hoes, then dowry will be paid to her family. Where the ground is tilled with ploughs by men, it'll be the other way around. And that's universal. I don't know of a single culture that differs from that. It's worth talking about things like, why does she go into the church with her father and then swaps arms and now she's married and comes out with her intended? In the old days, that really was a legal transfer of power because she belonged to her father until she was married, and then she belonged to him. And when you say in the service, who gives this woman to be married to this man, that had real legal significance. Go back 1,000 years. You see what I mean? And of course, go back a bit further and real money would have changed hands. In fact, would you believe it was possible to buy and sell wives in England as late as 1880? Yeah, literally. The last occasion that I'm aware of that somebody sold his wife to somebody else. The bride stands to the left of the groom. You remember that? And you remember how the families are separated. Yes? In every other church, you know, people mingle, don't they? Every other service, but not in the wedding. And so the reason, of course, is because, as is the case in a lot of traditions all around the world, there wasn't a proposal in the traditional sense. Couples didn't get to know one another and make a decision. What actually happened was a couple would get to know one another and decide they wanted to be married, and then he would kidnap her. Because if he didn't kidnap her, endless arguments would start between the families and a lot of money would be involved. So the simple way out of it was to get a bunch of your friends together, and catch her one night and take her away. So the best man was the captain of your little band, and the ushers were the others. And you would grab this girl, with her consent, by the way, and then you'd head for the hills. Now that's the reason why we never say where we're going on our honeymoon, because the honeymoon used to be before the wedding. Now it's rather more decorous, it's after the wedding. But in the old days, you would grab your bride, head for the hills, and stay out of sight for as long as it took. And then when all the tempers had calmed down, and it was quite obvious that she was not a maiden any longer, then you would sheepishly come back and start negotiating. But the families would have to come to an agreement now. So it made sure that there was going to be an agreement. Get the idea? Because the families probably didn't like each other too much, still, after all the negotiations. And the ushers keep them apart when they're kept apart on the two sides of the church. So the ushers are the remnants of the little private army that you used to go and kidnap your bride. And the bridesmaids are the remnants of the friends who confused the evil spirits. And in the old days, she did not carry flowers. She carried wheat. And a little girl would walk in front of her, scattering petals on the ground in front of her. Yes? And that was, again, evil spirits and all the rest of it, you know, make the way safe for her to walk. But she would carry wheat or some similar grain as a symbol of fertility. And after the ceremony, that little bit of wheat would be ground up and made into a little cake. And it would be thrown at people and people would eat it. And it was the origin of the wedding cake. But originally, it was only a tiny thing, you know what I mean?
Second, Dr. Chris gives us reasons as to why monogamy was introduced in the church. This relationship expert strongly believes that by looking at biology and other societies, this phenomenon does not exist.
If you look around the world, anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists have intensely studied about 1,290 odd societies. There are a few more, but they've not been studied. Of those, less than 200 are monogamous. The bulk of societies on this earth are not monogamous. They don't have any rules about how many wives there should be, or whether it should be till death us do part, or anything like that. They have a completely different set of rules. And so monogamous marriages with an intent that they should last a lifetime are in a very tight minority of cultures. Churches, without the slightest doubt, the medieval churches built up the tradition of true monogamy, till death us do part, a sacrament. But at the time when they created that sacrament, that was new. I'm just saying that it wasn't typical, and still isn't typical, of the rest of the world. You see, I think the problem is this. If you ask a biologist, are men and women designed to be monogamous? He'll give you 15 reasons, some of them pretty raunchy, why that's not true. He will say that man is a species which is partially monogamous. It's monogamous with cheating, he will say, biologically. Morally, our culture has chosen to say that you should be monogamous and have one wife for the rest of your life. But if you look at the biology, if you look at other societies, it's not common. Well, the famous one is the so-called travelling marriage. in a tribe in southwest China whose name I struggle to pronounce, and so I'm not going to try on TV. But basically the way their marriage works is this. A girl is born and reared in her family, and in that house, a big house with many generations, she will actually never leave. When she gets to an age to have children, she will move to a bedroom which has both an inside door into the house and an outside door into the street. And from that moment on, she will take callers, young men, and sooner or later, she will have children. She'll have a child. It's a matter of great importance to this tribe that she knows who the father is. So she will only have one at a time until she's pregnant. And then what happens is she will rear that child in that family, and her brothers will help her. The deal is that the brothers bring up their sister's children, and back in the house of the father, the same thing will be happening. And so those children will stay in that house, and in due course they will marry in, but there will be no marriage, there will be no new home. As a result, households in that tribe are immensely stable. They persist for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they obviously think that's a really good idea. They've been doing it for thousands of years. But it doesn't look anything like our idea of marriage. You see what I mean? It's very formal. He will pay his respects, he will come and he will visit and what have you. And when he will be acknowledged as the father, he will come and give gifts, but not rear gifts to the child. And as I say, it's all very well acknowledged, but she might have children by several men. She might not, but she might. And nobody will think anything of it. And she will never set up home with anybody. And so she will never be required to be monogamous with that man or anything like that, or own property. I only raise that because if you go around the world, wedding customs are very varied. And it's one of those sort of blind spots we have, that we think the way we do it is the only way. That is never true. You would not believe how varied the arrangements are around the world. Just talk to an anthropologist. He'll make your eyes water.
Third, Dr. Chris Hart firmly believes that there exists a correlation between the number of children a couple has and divorce.
But the fact remains that lots of different forms of wedding occur in this country. We have different religious traditions, we have the civil tradition, we have the customary traditions, and they vary quite a bit from tribe to tribe. And really, Kenya is like the world in microcosm. It's like the rest of the world. Now, in England, for example, there really are only two ways to get married. Okay, there are a small number of people from different cultures who are doing different things, but if you want your marriage to be recognized, there are only two ways to do it. Here, there are a lot more ways, and that reflects the fact that this is a much more varied society. I don't personally see anything wrong with that. The only thing that really matters to me in a marriage is that the couple have made a proper commitment to each other, which is a rather private matter, and that they have demonstrated it to the community. They have said to their families, to their church, whatever it is, that is happening. That's the only thing that really matters. The legalities are, to be honest, they're beginning to get unpopular. I don't know if you've noticed this around the world. In several of the more westernized cultures, there are now more single people than there are married people. People are declining to formally marry because they recognize that there are a lot of problems with that.